Marcus Mac Sullivan stood in the dusty driveway of what used to be his ranch, watching the bank's auctioneer hammer fall on the last of his cattle. At 38, he'd lost everything: 2,000 acres in East Texas, 300 head of cattle, the house his grandfather had built in 1952, and the respect of a community that had known the Sullivan name for 3 generations. The drought had lasted 2 years. The bank loans had come due 6 months ago. And now Mac's life's work was being sold piece by piece to pay debts that had accumulated like storm clouds before finally breaking over everything he'd tried to build. "That concludes today's auction," announced the auctioneer, a thin man in a too large suit who'd been professionally cheerful while dismantling Mac's dreams. "All sold items must be removed by Friday." Mac climbed into his battered Ford pickup, the only vehicle the bank had allowed him to keep, and drove away from the Sullivan Ranch for the last time. In the passenger seat sat a manila envelope containing the one piece of mail that had arrived during his final week on the property, a letter from a law firm in Denver informing him that he'd inherited property from his great-uncle Jeremiah Sullivan, a man Mac had never met and barely knew existed. The inheritance consisted of a 40-acre plot in the Colorado Rockies, a rustic cabin, and one 12-year-old Longhorn bull named Buster. Mac had laughed bitterly when he'd first read the letter. After losing a 2,000-acre ranch, inheriting 40 acres and a geriatric bull felt like the universe's cruel joke. But jokes were all Mac had left now. His savings account contained $847. His credit cards were maxed out. His ex-wife Sarah had taken their daughter Emma to live with her parents in Dallas, leaving Mac with visitation rights and child support obligations he couldn't afford to meet. The drive to Colorado took 12 hours, giving Mac plenty of time to contemplate how spectacularly his life had fallen apart. He'd been a 4th-generation rancher, raised to believe that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. The drought had taught him that sometimes the obstacles were bigger than individual will could handle. The GPS led him up increasingly narrow mountain roads until he reached a hand-painted sign that read, "Sullivan Property, No Trespassing." Mac turned onto a dirt track that wound through pine forests and aspen groves, climbing steadily toward the Continental Divide. The cabin appeared around a bend like something from a frontier museum. Built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with mud and moss, it looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1800s. The roof sagged in 2 places, the front porch leaned at an alarming angle, and the windows were so dirty Mac couldn't see through them. "Home, sweet home," Mac muttered, parking beside what appeared to be the remains of a barn that had partially collapsed under the weight of last winter's snow. As he climbed out of the truck, Mac heard the distinctive sound of hooves on stone. Around the corner of the cabin appeared the largest bull Mac had ever seen outside of Rodeo Arena. Buster was a magnificent Texas Longhorn with horns that spanned nearly 6 feet and coat that had faded from black to steel gray with age. Despite his size, the bull moved with the careful dignity of an old gentleman. His dark eyes studied Mac with obvious intelligence, and Mac had the strange sensation that he was being evaluated by an animal who'd seen decades of human folly and found most of it wanting. "You must be Buster," Mac said, approaching slowly with his hand extended. "I'm Mac. Looks like we're both stuck here." Buster snorted once and turned away, walking toward the tree line with the air of someone who had more important business to attend to. Mac watched the bull disappear into the forest, wondering what kind of life he'd inherited along with 40 acres of Rocky Mountain wilderness. The cabin's interior was as primitive as its exterior suggested. One room served as kitchen, living area, and dining room, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a wood-burning stove occupying another. A ladder led to a loft that contained a single bed and a trunk full of old clothes and personal effects. Mac found a kerosene lamp and managed to get it lit as darkness fell over the mountains. By its flickering light, he examined the papers the Denver law firm had provided. The inheritance included not just the cabin and Buster, but also mineral rights to the 40 acres, a detail that might have been significant if Mac had known anything about mining or geology. As he settled into the cabin's single chair, Mac felt the full weight of his situation settling over him like a physical presence. He was alone in the Colorado wilderness with an aging bull, less than $1,000 to his name, and no clear path forward. Outside, he could hear Buster moving around in the darkness, the bull's heavy footsteps creating a steady rhythm that somehow felt reassuring. At least Mac wasn't completely alone in his exile from the life he'd tried to build. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out how to survive on 40 acres and whatever resources his mysterious great-uncle had left behind. Tonight, he'd just try to get some sleep in a cabin that creaked and groaned like a ship riding out a storm, while an ancient bull kept watch over secrets that Mac didn't yet know existed. Did you enjoy Mac Sullivan's story? Then go ahead and hit that like button to support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the next chapters of this amazing journey. Also, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Mac woke to the sound of Buster's hooves clicking against stone, a rhythmic pattern that seemed too regular to be random grazing. Through the cabin's dirty window, he could see the massive Longhorn moving purposefully toward the eastern slope of the property, his gait steady and determined. It was the third morning in a row that Mac had witnessed this behavior. Every day around sunrise, Buster would leave the area around the cabin and head up the mountain, following what appeared to be an invisible trail through the pine trees. He'd return by late afternoon, often carrying the scent of high-altitude air and something else Mac couldn't identify, a metallic smell that reminded him of old pennies. Mac had spent his first week at the cabin taking inventory of his inheritance. The property was more rugged than he'd initially realized, with steep terrain that rose nearly 200 feet from the cabin to the eastern boundary. Dense forests of pine and aspen covered most of the land, broken by rocky outcroppings and small clearings where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the thin mountain air. The cabin itself was primitive but functional. Mac had managed to get the wood stove working, and he'd discovered that his great-uncle had left behind basic supplies: canned goods, kerosene for the lamps, and a small generator that could provide electricity for a few hours each day. There was even a well with a hand pump that produced clear, cold water that tasted better than anything Mac had ever gotten from a faucet. But Mac's financial situation remained desperate. His $847 was dwindling fast, eaten up by gas for the drive to Colorado and basic supplies from the tiny general store in Pine Ridge, the nearest town 15 miles down the mountain. He'd tried calling about employment opportunities, but jobs were scarce in the remote area, and his ranching experience didn't translate well to the tourist-based economy that sustained most mountain communities. Mac had been considering selling Buster to a livestock dealer in Denver when he'd started noticing the bull's strange daily routine. There was something almost ritualistic about the way the animal moved each morning, as if he was fulfilling an obligation or checking on something important. "Where do you go every day, old man?" Mac asked aloud as he watched Buster begin his morning trek. On impulse, Mac decided to follow. He grabbed a water bottle and a protein bar, one of his last, and headed up the slope behind the bull. Buster seemed aware of Mac's presence, but didn't alter his pace or direction. If anything, the bull appeared to approve of finally having human company on his mysterious journey. The terrain was challenging, with loose rock and steep grades that left Mac breathing heavily in the thin air. He was in good shape from years of ranch work, but the Colorado altitude was demanding respect from his Texas-accustomed lungs. Buster, despite his age, navigated the difficult ground with surprising agility. After 45 minutes of climbing, they reached a plateau roughly halfway up the eastern slope. Here, Buster paused beside what looked like a pile of weathered wooden beams and rusted metal fragments. Mac approached cautiously, trying to understand what he was seeing. The debris wasn't random. Beneath decades of pine needles and mountain weather, Mac could make out the remains of a structure: boards cut to specific lengths, metal brackets that had once held something together, and what appeared to be pieces of narrow-gauge railroad track. Mining equipment, Mac realized aloud. Colorado was riddled with abandoned mines from the gold and silver rushes of the 1800s. His great-uncle's property must have been part of a historical mining operation. Buster snorted once and continued climbing, following what Mac now recognized as an old mining road that had been reclaimed by forest. The bull's hooves found the most stable footing automatically, as if he'd walked this path thousands of times. 20 minutes later, they emerged into a clearing that took Mac's breath away. Carved into the mountainside was the entrance to a mine shaft, its opening framed by hand-hewn timber that had somehow survived more than a century of Rocky Mountain weather. A rusted sign beside the entrance read, "Silver Belle Mine, Esther to 1887. Buster walked directly to the mine entrance and stood there, his massive head lowered as if paying respects to something or someone Mac couldn't see. The bull's behavior was so solemn, so obviously meaningful, that Mac felt like he was intruding on a private ceremony. Mac approached the mine entrance carefully, peering into the darkness beyond the timber frame. The shaft extended back into the mountain, supported by wooden beams that looked more solid than he'd expected. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying that metallic scent he'd noticed on Buster each afternoon. Beside the mine entrance, partially hidden by decades of fallen leaves and pine needles, Mac discovered a small wooden structure that might once have been a mining office or equipment shed. The building was in remarkably good condition, protected by the same craftsmanship that had kept the mine entrance stable. Mac pushed open the shed's warped door and found himself looking at what appeared to be a frontier-era office frozen in time. A roll-top desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with papers that crumbled at his touch. Maps hung on the walls, their details faded but still showing the layout of mining claims throughout the area. But what caught Mac's attention was a modern metal filing cabinet that looked completely out of place among the antique furnishings. The cabinet was locked, but the key hung on a nail driven into the desk's side. Inside the filing cabinet, Mac found documents that made his heart race. Mineral rights surveys, geological reports, and correspondence with mining companies dating back to the 1990s. His great-uncle Jeremiah hadn't just been a mountain hermit living in a rustic cabin. He'd been sitting on potentially valuable mineral rights and had been in negotiations with several companies interested in reopening the Silver Belle Mine. The most recent document was a letter from the U.S. Forest Service, dated just 2 months before Jeremiah's death. The government was interested in purchasing the mineral rights to create a wilderness preserve, and the preliminary offer was for $2.3 million. Mac's hands shook as he read the letter again, unable to believe what he was seeing. Buster had led him to a mine that could solve all his financial problems and give him a fresh start he'd never dared hope for. Outside the shed, Buster waited patiently, as if he'd known all along that eventually someone would follow him up the mountain and discover the secret he'd been guarding for 12 years. The old bull had been the keeper of a fortune, waiting for the right person to inherit the wisdom he carried. Mac spent the rest of that day studying every document in the filing cabinet, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. The paperwork painted a complex picture of mineral rights, environmental assessments, and corporate interests that stretched back decades. The Silver Belle Mine had produced significant amounts of silver from 1887 until 1923, when falling silver prices and rising extraction costs had forced its closure. But recent geological surveys suggested the mine contained substantial untapped deposits, not just of silver, but also of rare earth minerals that had become incredibly valuable in the 21st century. 3 different mining companies had approached his great-uncle Jeremiah over the past 5 years, each offering substantial sums for the mineral rights. The U.S. Forest Service's $2.3 million offer was actually the lowest bid. A private mining consortium called Rocky Mountain Extractors had offered $4.2 million just 18 months earlier. But as Mac read deeper into the correspondence, he discovered complications that made his inheritance less straightforward than he'd initially hoped. Several of the letters referenced disputed claims and ongoing litigation involving the mineral rights. Apparently, Mac wasn't the only person who believed he owned valuable property in the Colorado Rockies. The next morning, Mac drove down to Pine Ridge to use the internet connection at the town's small library. What he found online made his stomach drop. Rocky Mountain Extractors had filed a lawsuit 3 months earlier, claiming that Jeremiah Sullivan's mineral rights were invalid due to a surveying error made in 1952. The company argued that the most valuable mineral deposits lay outside the boundaries of Mac's 40 acres. Even more troubling, Mac discovered that his ex-wife Sarah had been trying to reach him. She'd left 6 voicemails on his cell phone, which had been out of service range up at the cabin. When he finally called her back, her news added another layer of complexity to his situation. "Mac, thank God," Sarah said when she answered. "I've been trying to reach you for days. There are people looking for you. Men in suits asking questions about an inheritance and mineral rights. They came to my parents' house, wanting to know where you were living now." "What kind of questions?" Mac asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. "They said there might be irregularities with some property you inherited in Colorado. They wanted to know if you'd signed any documents or made any deals regarding mining rights." Mac felt his newfound hope beginning to crumble. Did they say who they worked for? Some mining company. Rocky Mountain something. Mac, what's going on? Emma keeps asking when she can see her daddy again, and I don't know what to tell her. The conversation with Sarah reminded Mac of everything he'd lost, and everything he stood to lose again if his mineral rights claim proved invalid. He'd allowed himself to hope that Buster's discovery could restore his relationship with his daughter and rebuild his life. Now that hope felt as fragile as the century-old timber supporting the Silver Belle Mine. Back at the cabin, Mac found Buster waiting by the truck, as if the bull had sensed trouble brewing. Mac scratched behind the animal's ears, drawing comfort from the bull's steady presence. "What do you think, old man?" Mac asked. "Are we sitting on a fortune, or just another kind of fool's gold?" That afternoon, a black SUV with Denver plates pulled up the dirt road to the cabin. Two men in expensive suits climbed out, their city shoes completely inappropriate for the Rocky Mountain terrain. Mac watched them approach from the cabin's front porch, Buster positioned protectively nearby. "Mr. Sullivan," the taller man called out. "I'm Robert Hayes from Rocky Mountain Extractors. This is my associate, Michael Chen. We'd like to discuss your recent inheritance with you." Mac remained seated on the porch steps, projecting a calm he didn't feel. "I'm not sure there's much to discuss. I inherited 40 acres and an old bull. Not exactly mining company material." Hayes smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, we both know that's not entirely accurate. Your great-uncle was in possession of mineral rights that our geological surveys indicate may be quite valuable. However, there appear to be some legal irregularities regarding the boundaries of those rights." "What kind of irregularities?" Mac asked. Chen opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "The original survey work done when your great-uncle acquired the mineral rights contains errors that place the most valuable deposits outside your property boundaries. We've filed suit to have the rights properly adjudicated." Mac felt his anger rising. These men were trying to steal his inheritance using legal technicalities, preying on his desperation and lack of resources to fight a prolonged court battle. "And I suppose you're here to offer me a settlement," Mac said. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for any legitimate claims you might have to mineral rights on this property," Hayes said. "Given the legal uncertainties, we think that's quite generous." Mac looked at Buster, who was watching the strangers with obvious distrust. The bull's ears were pinned back, and his massive frame radiated the kind of tension that preceded a charge. "I'll need to review your paperwork with an attorney before making any decisions," Mac said finally. Hayes and Chen exchanged glances. "Mr. Sullivan, legal battles over mineral rights can drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands in attorney fees. We're offering you a clean settlement that could resolve your financial difficulties immediately." The men knew about his bankruptcy and divorce. They'd done their homework, hoping to pressure him into accepting a fraction of what the mineral rights might be worth. "I appreciate the offer," Mac said, standing up slowly. "But I'm not ready to make any deals today." As the SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Mac realized he was facing the fight of his life. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. He had Buster, 40 acres of Rocky Mountain wilderness, and mineral rights that might be worth millions if he could find a way to prove they belonged to him. Mac spent the next 3 days driving between small mountain towns, trying to find a lawyer who would take his case. Most attorneys he contacted either specialized in areas unrelated to mineral rights or wanted retainer fees he couldn't afford. His 847 had dwindled to less than $200, barely enough for gas and basic supplies. At the Gunnison County Library, Mac researched everything he could find about mineral rights disputes and the history of the Silver Belle Mine. What he discovered gave him both hope and concern. The mine had indeed been highly productive during its operational years, but the area's mineral rights had changed hands multiple times over the decades, creating a complex web of claims and counterclaims. However, Mac also found something Rocky Mountain Extractors apparently hadn't expected him to discover: a 1952 court ruling that had specifically validated his great-uncle's mineral rights claim after a previous boundary dispute. The ruling was buried in old county records, but it clearly established that Jeremiah Sullivan held legitimate title to the mineral deposits beneath his 40 acres. Armed with this information, Mac drove to Grand Junction to meet with Elena Rodriguez, a mining rights attorney who had agreed to a free consultation after hearing about his case. Rodriguez was a compact woman in her 40s who had spent 15 years representing small property owners against large mining corporations. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, reviewing the documents Mac had brought from the cabin, "this is actually more straightforward than I expected. Your great-uncle's mineral rights are clearly valid, and Rocky Mountain Extractors' lawsuit appears to be what we call frivolous litigation. They're hoping to pressure you into settlement by making the legal process expensive and intimidating." "So I actually own the mineral rights?" "According to these documents, absolutely. The 1952 court ruling you found is particularly important. It establishes legal precedent that directly contradicts RME's claims about boundary disputes." Mac felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "What would it cost to fight their lawsuit?" Rodriguez's expression became more serious. "That's where things get complicated. Even though your case is strong, RME has deep pockets and can afford to drag out the litigation for years. They'll file motion after motion, demand extensive discovery, and generally try to exhaust your resources before the case reaches trial." "How much are we talking about?" "Conservatively, $150,000 to $200,000 in legal fees to see this through to completion, and that's assuming they don't appeal an adverse ruling." Mac's heart sank. Even if he owned mineral rights worth millions, he couldn't afford the legal battle necessary to prove his ownership. Rodriguez seemed to sense his despair. "However, there might be another option. The Forest Service's offer to purchase your mineral rights for conservation purposes could provide leverage. If we can demonstrate that the government recognizes your legitimate ownership, it might pressure RME to drop their lawsuit or accept a reasonable settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "Based on the geological reports in your great-uncle's files, I'd estimate your mineral rights are worth between $3 to $5 million. Even if we settled for half that amount, it would change your life significantly." Mac drove back to the cabin with his mind racing. For the first time since losing his ranch in Texas, he had a clear path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require fighting people with far more resources than he possessed, but it was possible. He found Buster waiting by the cabin, and the bull's presence reminded Mac that he wasn't just fighting for himself. His great-uncle had spent decades protecting these mineral rights, and Buster had faithfully guarded the secret for 12 years. Mac owed it to both of them to see this through. That evening, Mac sat on the cabin's front porch with Buster lying nearby, watching the sun set behind the Continental Divide. His phone rang, a rare occurrence since cell service was spotty at the cabin's elevation. "Mac, it's Elena Rodriguez. I've been doing more research on your case, and I have some interesting news." "What kind of news?" "Rocky Mountain Extractors filed similar lawsuits against 3 other mineral rights owners in Colorado over the past 2 years. All 3 cases were settled out of court for substantially less than the rights were worth. I think we're dealing with a pattern of predatory litigation designed to intimidate small property owners." Mac felt his anger rising. "They're running a scam." "Essentially, yes. But here's the interesting part. The Colorado Attorney General's office has been investigating RME for fraudulent business practices. If we can coordinate with their investigation, we might be able to not only protect your mineral rights, but also expose their entire operation." "What would that mean for my case?" "It could mean that instead of just defending your ownership, we go on the offensive, sue them for harassment, intimidation, and attempted fraud. If we win, they might be responsible for your legal fees and additional damages." After hanging up, Mac looked at Buster, who seemed to be listening to every word. "What do you think, old man? Ready to take on the corporate bullies?" Buster snorted once, as if to say he'd been ready for this fight for 12 years. Mac realized he was no longer just trying to survive his financial collapse. He was fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for his great-uncle's legacy, and for other small property owners who'd been victimized by Rocky Mountain Extractors' predatory practices. The battle ahead would be difficult, but Mac had something his opponents didn't expect: the determination of a man who'd lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. 6 months later, Mac stood in the same Denver courtroom where Rocky Mountain Extractors had hoped to strip him of his mineral rights. Instead, he watched as federal judge Catherine Morrison handed down her ruling in favor of the Colorado Attorney General's case against RME for fraudulent business practices. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of predatory litigation designed to intimidate small property owners into surrendering legitimate mineral rights claims, Judge Morrison stated. Rocky Mountain Extractors will pay $2.4 million in damages to affected property owners and face additional penalties under Colorado's consumer protection statutes. Elena Rodriguez leaned over to whisper in Mac's ear. Your share of the settlement is $800,000, plus they're dropping all claims against your mineral rights. The Forest Service deal is still on the table if you want it. Mac nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication. The legal battle had lasted half a year, during which he'd lived on beans and rice while Buster had grazed on mountain grass, both of them waiting to see if justice would prevail over corporate greed. But the real victory had come 3 weeks earlier, when Mac received a call from his daughter Emma. Daddy? Mommy says you won your big fight and you can afford to see me again, the 9-year-old had said, her voice bright with excitement. Can I come visit your cabin and meet Buster? Mommy showed me pictures and he looks like a dinosaur. That conversation had meant more to Mac than any amount of money. Now, walking out of the courthouse with a settlement check and clear title to mineral rights worth millions, Mac felt like he was starting his life over from a position of strength rather than desperation. Elena caught up with him on the courthouse steps. So what's your plan? Take the Forest Service money and retire rich, or hold on to the mineral rights and see what develops? Mac had been considering this question for weeks. The Forest Service was still offering $2.3 million to turn his 40 acres into protected wilderness. Several mining companies, legitimate ones this time, had expressed interest in leasing the mineral rights for extraction operations that could generate income for decades. I think I'm going to do something different, Mac said. I want to create a trust that protects the land while generating income for conservation efforts and local economic development. Maybe fund scholarships for kids from mountain communities, support sustainable tourism, things like that. Elena smiled. Your great uncle would be proud. He spent his last years trying to figure out how to protect the land while helping the local community. You're finishing what he started. The drive back to Pine Ridge took Mac past landscapes that had become familiar over the past 6 months. He'd grown to love the Colorado high country in a way that was different from his attachment to the Texas ranch he'd lost. This felt more like stewardship than ownership, a responsibility to preserve something valuable for future generations. Back at the cabin, Mac found Buster waiting in his usual spot by the front porch. The old bull looked up as Mac approached, his dark eyes still holding that same intelligence that had guided Mac to the Silver Belle Mine. Well, old man, we did it, Mac said, scratching behind Buster's ears. Your secret is safe, and we've got enough money to keep this place running for a long time. Over the following months, Mac used his settlement money to renovate the cabin while preserving its historical character. He installed solar panels and a modern water system, but kept the wood stove and kerosene lamps that connected the present to the property's frontier past. Emma came to visit that summer, spending 2 weeks learning to fish in mountain streams and helping Mac tend to a small garden he'd planted near the cabin. She was enchanted by Buster, who seemed to understand that this small human required special gentleness and patience. Daddy, why does Buster go up the mountain every morning? Emma asked during her second week. I think he's checking on something important, Mac replied, making sure everything is where it should be. Can we go with him tomorrow? Mac smiled. I think he'd like that. The next morning, all 3 of them made the journey to the Silver Belle Mine. Mac had installed a gate across the mine entrance for safety, but they could sit in the clearing and enjoy the spectacular view of the Continental Divide while Buster performed his daily ritual of standing vigil over the site. This is where great-great-uncle Jeremiah's treasure was hidden? Emma asked. Not treasure exactly, Mac explained. More like a gift that took time to understand. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we have to work hardest to appreciate. Emma nodded with the seriousness that children bring to important conversations. Like how you had to lose your old ranch to find this one. Mac was continually amazed by his daughter's wisdom. Exactly like that. As autumn approached and Emma returned to school in Dallas, Mac finalized the legal structure for the Sullivan Conservation Trust. The trust would preserve the 40 acres in perpetuity while using income from carefully managed mineral extraction to fund environmental and educational programs throughout the Colorado Rockies. The Forest Service had enthusiastically endorsed the plan, and several conservation organizations had offered to help manage the trust's activities. Mac would serve as the property's caretaker, living in the renovated cabin and ensuring that Jeremiah's legacy continued to benefit both the land and the surrounding communities. On the first anniversary of his arrival at the cabin, Mac sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Buster lay nearby, content in the knowledge that his long guardianship of the family secret had finally achieved its purpose. Mac's phone rang, Sarah calling from Dallas. "Emma can't stop talking about her summer with you," Sarah said, her voice warm with something Mac hadn't heard in years. "She wants to spend Christmas at the cabin if that's okay with you." "More than okay," Mac replied. "There's something magical about these mountains in winter." After hanging up, Mac reflected on the journey that had brought him from the auction block of his failed Texas ranch to this peaceful evening in the Colorado Rockies. He'd learned that sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what truly mattered. Buster had taught him that the most valuable treasures were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to follow the right guide to the right destination. The old bull had saved not just Mac's financial future, but his relationship with his daughter and his faith in the possibility of second chances. As the stars appeared in the thin mountain air, Mac made his own promise to continue the daily journey to the Silver Belle Mine. Not to guard a secret anymore, but to honor the wisdom of an old bull who had understood that some gifts are worth waiting a lifetime to share. This story reminds us that our greatest defeats can become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. Mac Sullivan discovered that losing everything he thought he wanted led him to find everything he actually needed. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance comes not from what we're given, but from what we're willing to follow when an unexpected guide shows us the way forward. Broke rancher inherited a cabin and an old bull, until the bull led him to a life-changing secret.